I'm going to bring you now on to Chris McFarland, and Chris is going to talk to you about the key definitions within the legislation. Those are the key definitions of what constitutes additional learning needs. So, Chris, thanks for joining us today, and over to you, my friend.
Thank you very much, Mike. So as Mike explained there, there's going to be a number of substantial changes to the law of special educational needs here in Wales. And in particular, it's phasing out the phrase special educational needs and special educational provision and replacing it with a new term of additional learning needs and consequently additional learning provision. So in this section, we're going to talk about some of the key definitions. You know, a lot of words will be bandied about in this seminar, such as additional learning needs and also individual development plans. Well, you know, what are they? You know, what do those mean? So we've got a few slides here to help that understanding. So the first one we've got here is the definition of additional learning needs, and this is at section 2 of the Act. So the definition is a person has additional learning needs if he or she has a learning difficulty or disability, whether the learning difficulty or disability arises from a medical condition or otherwise, which calls for additional learning provision. And then what they go on to expand is then that a child of compulsory school age or person over that age has a learning difficulty or disability if he or she, A, has a significantly greater difficulty in learning than the majority of others the same age, or B, has a disability for the purposes of the Equality Act 2010. And really, you know, that's very similar, if not virtually identical, to the tests that we have now, both in Wales and in England. So this is not so much a change in how we perceive those with special educational needs. It's more of a rephrasing of that to additional learning needs and the use of this new terminology. Likewise, moving on to additional learning provision, which is section 3 of the Act, that is defined as for a person aged 3 or more means educational or training provision that is additional to or different from that made generally for others of the same age in mainstream maintained schools in Wales, mainstream institutions in further educational sector in Wales, or places in Wales at which nursery education is provided. And then additional learning provision for those under 3 means educational provision of any kind. So what's useful here is the definition is very similar to that we see currently under the Education Act 1996. So again, they're not looking to move the goalposts here, looking to keep it relatively close to the current system. But there is a slight tweak here that currently, when we're looking at special educational provision here, currently under the system, we're looking at that in the local area. So what is being applied in the local area? And that can mean that in very rare circumstances, you could have something that would be provision, perhaps in the Vale of Glamorgan, but perhaps not provision in Rhondda-Cynon-Taf. Now, those examples are extremely rare. But here now they're extending the definition to what would be applied generally in mainstream maintained schools in Wales. So it wouldn't really matter that variance between those local areas. And local areas couldn't claim, well, we do a bit more of this naturally, so it wouldn't be provision here. It would actually be a case that, well, if that's still across the whole of Wales, considered to be additional to or different from that would be available at your maintained mainstream schools, then it would count as provision here. We saw a very similar, if not nearly identical, change during the Children and Families Act 2014 in England, and that has already been the subject of various cases and definitions there. So moving on to individual development plans. Well, what is an individual development plan? Well, it will replace the statement and it will be the new statutory document for those with special educational needs here in Wales. And we're looking here at the key definition, which is in section 10 of the ALN Act. And it says, for the purposes of this Act, an individual development plan is a document that contains A, a description of the person's additional learning needs, B, a description of the additional learning provision which the person's learning difficulty or disability calls for, C, anything else required or authorised by or under this Act. And we will come on later to discuss that in more detail. And luckily here, one of the key differences and challenges, I think, with the changes in England with the Children and Families Act 2014 is the Act specified a lot of what was to be in education and healthcare plans, as they're known over in England, but it didn't actually give them a format. It just told them what was to be in it. And you ended up getting a kind of kaleidoscope of different approaches across local authorities in England, each interpreting the education healthcare plan in their own way, sometimes very well, sometimes very poorly, and everywhere in between. And it could be quite challenging for parents and even for us as practitioners to look at these various plans thinking, hang on, have we actually got an education healthcare plan here? Or is this some kind of non-statutory plan? I know of one education authority in England in particular that used to call their education healthcare plans My Plan, which was not helpful to anyone because no one knew what it was called. So here they've actually set out a format. It's in Annex A of the Code of Practice. So there will be a standardised form for local authorities in Wales and schools and further educational colleges in Wales to complete. So it will keep things uniform, which will be helpful indeed. So yes, just summarising then, the key definitions. So the term special educational needs has now been abolished and will be replaced with the term additional learning needs. Additional learning provision is defined as provision that is additional to or different from that could be expected within a typical mainstream institution across Wales. And very similar to the existing definitions of SEN and special education provision that we've already talked about. It's not intended to change it except for the terminology used. And IDPs are to function similarly to statements, which we'll go on to later in the conference, but with differences in form, content, and the body responsible to them. So Mike, Charlotte, turning back to you for a second. Now we've talked about some of those key definitions. Mike, is there anything that sticks out to you, perhaps, from those that you think needs to be highlighted at this stage?
Well, I mean, I highlighted a lot, didn't I, Chris, about I didn't like the term additional learning needs back when it was first introduced. I thought it was nicer and softer to refer to needs as being special educational needs, but we have to live with that term now. The reason for that was that, I think that to try and say that someone has a number of needs, but here you have some additional ones, is not as nice as to say that a child has special educational needs. There's something special about that child that I preferred that term, frankly, but then we have to live with the term as it is. But I think there's a lot to applaud in relation to the idea, as you say, about from a practical perspective, we're now looking at what provision is available in Wales as the benchmark to decide whether or not someone could qualify for additional learning provision. And I think that's better because that will avoid local authorities having, as we've seen in England, having different strategies and processes to try and devolve to schools support that they will say, well, actually, we've got more here than maybe a neighbouring authority, and therefore you don't need an education healthcare plan. Whereas I know that's not a lawful approach in England because, of course, they should compare what's available throughout England, not just the local authority. But of course, that was something that hasn't happened in Wales until now, and we've got this introduction. So I think that's a good thing in practical, from a practical perspective. I mean, Charlotte, do you agree with that?
I think I do. I definitely agree that a national comparison is better because it removes sort of unevenness of provision across from local authority to local authority, and it kind of forces local authorities to sort of aspire upwards in terms of provision rather than downwards. You don't have a situation where a local authority can kind of set the bar for when you get additional learning provision based on what it itself provides, which always seemed like a bit of an oddity to me under the Education Act. The only other thing that I noticed is that it's made clear in this Act, unlike in the sort of corresponding English legislation, it's made clear that a disability has to be a disability that is a qualifying disability under the Equality Act. I mean, there's a slight question mark over whether that the English legislation doesn't say that. Slight question mark over whether you could have a disability that didn't qualify under the Equality Act, but they have clarified that in this legislation. And I agree with you, Mike. I'm a little bit disappointed by kind of the proliferation of acronyms. I'm not sure that we need another term for special educational needs. And I agree with you that additional learning needs isn't really as sort of inclusive a term, I guess I would say.
Well, that was my thoughts, because, I have a child with special educational needs, and I used to always say how special he was. And I think it's a softer phrase, but we have to live with it, don't we? I mean, Chris, you know it as well in your own personal experience.
Yeah, that's right. Obviously, I'm growing up with my sister having special educational needs. I think that, as you say, that word special, they are special people, of course, but you'd like to think it was softer. I think they've tried to go to a more neutral term, perhaps a more clinical term. And I think that, I think there's pros and cons to that. I think, the pro to that is, I suppose, it's less likely, to be used as any kind of derogatory tone. We know kids can be cruel. But of course, I suppose it does take away from the positive, which, of course, as you say, Mike, these children were special, and rightfully, it was nice that the term was that. And again, Charlotte, I definitely agree with you, though, that the alphabet soup of acronyms of ALN, SEN, SEP, ALP, it's hard enough for parents and teachers, and especially with their heightened role in this legislation, to be dealing with so many different terms and for people perhaps to speak across purposes. I think there may have been a lack of wisdom. I am going to highlight, actually, with the IDPs, we're going to talk about these in a bit of detail later, but I just wanted to highlight this because it is part of the definition, which, since we're all lawyers here, we'll point out as a bit of a spoiler alert. But I don't know if you both picked up on that. It doesn't say that the plan specifies these descriptions, just says it contains. And I wondered if that was a selective choice of drafting in comparison to what we see in the Education Act and in the Children and Families Act, where it says it is a plan specifying X, Y, and Z. Was here it contains. And of course, we all know that the specification of plans is extremely important, and much of the case law surrounding that specification has very much turned on the fact that the Act itself used that term. So do you think there might have been a sneaky softening there of the requirements in relation to IDPs?
I think that's for the next part of the presentation, Chris.
Jumping ahead.
Let's not give anything away.
Well, stay tuned to find out the answer to that and more questions.
I suppose one can perhaps think, when this legislation was first being proposed, we all were swinging our arms about, some of us were delighted and others were a bit disturbed that many young people will either get or not get, of course, the plan based on the description of what constitutes special educational additional learning needs. I'm using the phrase myself, additional learning needs, and the link between the definition and the provision when it comes to qualifying for a plan. So if you have a school system, an education system throughout Wales, which is under-resourced, one would think that everyone will be getting an individual development plan, because the under-resource is going to require additional support than that which would ordinarily be available. If you've got special education, additional learning needs, and you require additional support, it's going to be additional too, because of course the schools are under-resourced anyway. But that's another story for politics, perhaps.